Hi everybody. I just wanted to give a little bit of feedback on the legacy modules. I've been grading through them and there's a few pieces of information that I want to make sure I highlight or clarify based off of the submissions that I've been seeing. So the first thing is, why is AT important? So just about everybody was able to explain how assistive technology helps students learn better, it helps them engage in the curriculum, and it gives them access to the general ed curriculum. But I want to make sure that we are making the connection that absolutely it helps in those ways, and it helps in those ways for all students. What makes it different when we have a student on an IEP is that it becomes part of FAPE, which is that free and appropriate public education. And so that makes it a little different because now it's a legal mandate. So I'm saying that not because I think that if it's not legally mandated that you're not going to do what's best for students. What I want to make sure that you understand is that it is incredibly important when you are legally obligated to provide these services or provide this support that you as a teacher who is not necessarily an expert in assistive technology makes the effort to ask questions to get to know how to use this device, because you are going to be legally obligated to do so. When you don't utilize this as part of your curriculum, you put yourself at risk for legal intervention, and you just don't want to put yourself in that position. That being said, I'm not saying that as a scare tactic. I'm mostly just saying this because I want to make sure you understand that when you're sitting at that meeting and you might not understand what's happening, you need to ask questions and you need to ask for support. And you shouldn't feel the slightest bit worried about doing so, because you know that you are legally obligated to do this and they're legally obligated to support you. So the second piece is that a lot of people mentioned the classroom and how assistive technology helps in the classroom, but I also want to make sure that we're focusing on how assistive technology helps in all areas of life. We want to make sure that all students that have a disability are able to experience the world in as close to the same way as their neurotypical peers and their physically able peers. So think about, how are you going to generalize the use of the technology in your classroom to all these other settings as well? And lastly, a lot of people mentioned that it makes learning easier or makes life easier for students. And in some ways, absolutely. Assistive technology can help make things easy, no doubt. For example, if we use a pencil grip, right away, it's going to be easier for a student who's struggling with fine motor skills to hold on to that pencil. It's going to make it easier for them to write. They're going to have a better grip. So in that sense, absolutely, it's going to help make life easier. However, I don't want to make the generalization that assistive technology always makes life easier for students. One example that I'm thinking of specifically is students with cerebral palsy who are nonverbal and are using eye gaze software as a method to communicate. When you're using eye gaze software, you're holding your head up, you're looking at something on a screen, and you're holding your gaze on something particular for a couple seconds so that it registers with the computer, and then it will click on it and the computer will say what it is that you're trying to say. When you think about that in a student with cerebral palsy who might be struggling with muscle control, and it's hard for them to hold their head up, let alone hold it still and hold their gaze on one particular spot on a screen for any extended period of time, you can start to understand how it isn't necessarily easier, it's just the method that makes it possible. So I say that because I want to make sure that we always remember to understand what our students might be going through, and that we don't want to just think that because a student has a device that now things are easy. Things become easy when students are able to use the device on a regular basis. It becomes habit and it becomes second nature. There's probably always going to be barriers in place, and it's not always going to be just as easy as it is for you or I to talk and communicate with each other, even with the use of assistive technology. So I wanted to make sure I pointed that out. Moving on, I want to talk about a few things in terms of planning that weren't specifically mentioned in the legacy module. The first is that when you're sitting at the meeting, You want to make sure that you remember that the plan should be driven by student need, not by financial restrictions or not by convenience of what's available in the district. This is something that I've experienced, and it makes me a little bit nutty when it happens. But you'll be sitting in a meeting and the assisted tech person's like, oh, this would be awesome. There's this device that does this, blah, blah, blah. And somebody from the district's like, well, we don't have that and we don't have the money to purchase that. We're going to have to come up with something else. When that happens, the best way that I try to approach it is to say, let's keep focused on the student right now. I know that there's agencies and resources available to help support the purchasing of assisted technology. So let's figure out what the best plan would be, and we'll work out some of those details later. That's usually enough to redirect the conversation and focus back on what are solutions without focusing on what is available and how do we make it fit for what the student needs. The next thing that you want to think about is that the plan should focus on fostering independence in the student. So it shouldn't be set up so that a student is always going to need a teacher to prompt them to use it, that a para is always going to need to be next to the student in order to use it, that the assisted tech team is always going to have to come in and keep training the student on it. Our goal is to have a plan in place where we fade supports and put the ownership of using the assisted technology in the student's hands. Now, obviously, younger students, it might take a little bit longer, and as you move up the grades or as you change devices, there's always going to be that element of supports needed and transitioning and implementing and all of that good stuff. However, our ultimate goal is not to make a student dependent on us to help them use whatever they're getting to use. We want the goal to be that the student learns how to use this from us, and then we are no longer in charge and they're driving it. So always keep that in mind. If it seems that a lot of the focus is on making sure that there's always a person there to support the use of the device, you change it or you try to redirect it to how do we set this up better in the front so that we can fade and not have this be an issue moving forward. An additional consideration when developing the plan should absolutely be about you, the teacher, and making sure that you're supported with whatever prep needs to be done ahead of time or whatever system needs to be set up to get whatever's created on a device out of the device so that you can grade it. And so that's one piece that a lot of times we don't focus on during these meetings is problem solving for the teacher, because we just assume that, we'll figure it out. The reality is that there's only so much time in a day, and if it's sounding like there's going to be a lot of prep work involved, take the time to talk about that in the implementation planning, because we'll want to have a system in place so that this doesn't feel like such an overwhelming burden that you aren't able to get what needs to be done ready in time so that the student can use it when you're teaching the class. So I want to make sure that I point out to you that it is absolutely okay to ask for help for yourself just as much as it is to ask for help for your student. So keep that in mind if you're sitting there and starting to feel very overwhelmed by the amount of extra work this seems to be creating for you. Ask, problem solve, utilize your strategies, and get creative. There are ways to do this where you're not going to feel like you have a million other things put on your plate because of it. So along those same lines, there's a few other things that I wanted to make sure that I pointed out for you to consider as a teacher. So as I mentioned before, there might be some prep. So know that lesson plans will most likely need to be completed early. So if you are going to be leveraging the use of, let's say, a vision team to help you scan and prep materials, they might have a request that things get to them at least a week in advance. So if you're one of those people that doesn't plan in advance, this might be something that changes the way that you operate. I can tell you that I always tried to be weeks in advance, but there were some times where, you're running behind. Usually I would just scan those things in myself. So that's why it was always important that I knew how to use it as well. But typically by having a routine set up, I didn't find it to be that difficult to make this happen without it feeling so overwhelming on me. The second thing is that it may take a while to get used to some of these devices, and know that. The amount of devices that I have encountered now teaching have been vast, and so there are some times that I can think of in my head where just that first couple months of trying to get used to it, just like anything else that we do, it's kind of tricky and it seems a little bit like something extra. But again, it becomes second nature, and once it does, the benefits are so important to the students and to just the possibilities that are now open to them, that I always remind myself of that when I'm, having one of those days. So I just want to make sure you know that. Don't feel bad if it's taking you a while to get used to it. Stick with it. I promise it's worth it. Along those same lines as well is that you want to put as much responsibility on the student as possible. So for example, set up a place in the room where you keep a device, or you keep, let's say the lined paper or supplies of, pencil grips, or, those kinds of things, so that when the student needs it, they're able to go get that themselves. You don't have to remember to go walk over and grab it or whatever it is. So make sure that you get the student to participate and be an active member in getting their needs met. You might also be able to have the student take ownership of scanning things in. When I was talking about the post work, I'm thinking about when students are using a typewriter or a computer, and so they might need to print things. Don't make it your responsibility to be in charge of printing things or tracking down their materials. Teach them how to print them. Teach them how to email it to you. Teach them how to submit it in whichever way you need them to, and put that ownership on them. I've seen a lot of times where students will walk up with their computer and give it to their teacher at the end of the class, and then the teacher prints it out and goes and gets it, or whatever the heck it is. Don't do that. Don't put more work on yourself. Enable that, or support that student so that they're able to do these things for themselves. The last thing I want to mention is the importance of teaching the entire class about equity versus equality, meaning that everybody gets the same thing or everybody gets what they need. So I always like to use the example of glasses. So if I have glasses, I know that I need glasses to be able to see. Without them, I can't see. The person next to me might not need glasses because they see just fine, right? So when we talk about that, it seems very black and white. Well, yeah, if you can't see, you should absolutely have your glasses so that you can see. It wouldn't be fair if we didn't let you have your glasses and you need them to see, because you wouldn't be able to read with everybody else, right? Another thing might be a wheelchair, right? Not every student has a wheelchair because not every student needs a wheelchair. But it wouldn't be right to not give a student a wheelchair because everybody else isn't getting one. So I always try to start with something tangible and concrete and then work my way into maybe explaining. So just in the same way that some students need glasses to see, some students might need a device to help them be able to talk, or they might need a device in order to help them be able to do their work in the same way that somebody else might. So just make sure that you have some of those conversations with your students, and don't let the fear of the why does she and not me be what prevents you from implementing something in your classroom that's going to make a huge difference for a student that really needs it. So I hope that this just gave you a little bit of an overview and gave you some things to think about, and hopefully guides you in your direction as you continue on as a teacher.